Yes, okay, so back, what a whirlwind, back here in Portland. So last night I went to hear my colleague Ron Glass from the Center for Collaborative Research for More Equitable California. He was presenting at LAPES, and I'm going to post my short snip that I grabbed from Ron's presentation. I'll put that up in later today with some commentary. And then it was cool, we went to Harlem to Red Rooster restaurant, and the venue had some music, and then flew back into Portland, went down to Portsmouth right away, New Hampshire, where I met with my colleague Winston Thompson, who's got a cool project going on. It's called Pipeline, which is the acronym is escaping right now, but it's a podcast in philosophy of education. That's what it is. And so we recorded a session there in the corner of Daniel and Market, I think it was, and right in downtown Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And I have a video that I made, but it's having trouble, it's not processing correctly. So anyway, that all brings me back here to Portland for PPM44, originally written this date 10 years ago, March the 28th, 2004. So this is still kind of in the beginning of chapter 4. I don't have being and learning with me, but it is at the very beginning of the chapter 4, which is on the Allegory of the Cave. And in this chapter, I sort of set it up as moving from, it's kind of like a backward movement, where if we were out wandering with the sage in chapter 3, we're now backing up and sort of back to the beginning. You know, where does this learning get underway? What is the state that we are in prior to the, you know, what's called the awakening or the emancipation, the realization, the dawn of learning, if you will, right? And so if learning is always a possibility, but it is initiated by a certain moment in which we come to recognize that freedom is there, that we have this, what I call the effacement with being's presencing, and the offering of freedom is made to us. And I think that this can happen in all sorts of ways, but I'm not going to give a psychological or sociological or cultural account for it, but I'm rather tracing this genealogically in the history of philosophy. And so what I've done now is moved into the Allegory of the Cave, which I could have talked about Parmenides' poem, because I think that that poem, the fragments we have of it, describe also this sort of awakening, right? So that youth is taken in his chariot and is, you know, past the gates of night and day, and then arrives to the goddess who gives him the telling, the most, I suppose, evocative saying about being, and she talks specifically about being. The Allegory of the Cave, though, is interesting and important to me, because the Allegory of the Cave, first of all, personally, is the principal sort of text for me. It's the one that sort of really sort of initiated my study of philosophy. It's the first primary piece of philosophy that really got me going in terms of the study of philosophy. This is way back when I was a freshman at Fordham. But it also captures, better than anything that I know of, this moment where we are sort of, you know, awakened to our freedom. You know, Immanuel Kant talks about, you know, have the courage to use your own reasoning. But then he begs the question in saying that, well, how is it that we gain the courage to do so? How do we come to that place where we have the courage to use that? Or moreover, how do we recognize that we have this freedom to think on our own, to reason independently? How do we come to realize we have reason? I think that Plato's Allegory of the Cave really shows us in so many complicated ways, and what I try to do in this chapter, the ways in which we are sort of formed and socialized, and Kant makes this point too, but Plato, I think, is the first one to say that, you know, in the social and political world that we live in, we're really hampered by our society, by the norms, by the cultural value system, all these ways in which we are taken away from ourselves, and we come not to understand that we have a power of freedom, but on the contrary, that we are only led to believe and live under the misunderstanding that how we perceive the world is our own, but in fact it's just what we've inherited, and it's just the ways in which others see the world. And if you want to do a class analysis, it's the dominant class's values, and Plato's allegory also allows us to do that. So let's take it up then from this date. And so I'm in the beginning of a chapter on the allegory of the cave. Chapter 4, from being and learning. So, but at this point, though, of course, I'm just writing on the allegory of the cave. Later, it'll become chapter 4. If we are to understand that the allegory is situated within this evocative, mysterious question, who are we? Then our listening to this story enables us to recognize why the link between the essence of truth and the essence of education is always transformative, or situated within the twofold play, and thereby expressing the fundamental relationality of our experience as unfolding within a mysterious, unknowable, nameless other, a nowhere from which we arrive and appear together, and a not yet toward which we are pulled, drawn to as a destinal destination, a destiny. How is it that the story tells us about this destiny? The allegory or parable gets underway after Socrates has taken Glaucon, who is his partner in the discussion, through the stages of knowledge, from the lowest part called the visible to the highest beyond where one receives a vision of the good. As Cornford notes, this beyond, quote, corresponds to the greater mysteries of which Diotima speaks in the Symposium. The two worlds that emerges from the stages of knowledge are intended to represent the movement or passage from conventional knowledge or common sense to philosophical thinking or contemplation. They are also importantly linked to the proper form of education that should occur if the people are interested in coming together and forming a society under republican ideals. By the time Plato has Socrates offer the parable, he has arrived at the conjecture that a transformative education is the key to engaging people in the project of forming a common good through sharing and fellowship. What is clear from the story is that this transformative education is arduous and will be resisted by those who have become accustomed to the illusion of their domestic tranquility and unwilling to hear the call to join in this project. Here, through Plato's parable, we will return to the problem of evocative speech being received as a provocation, an irritation, and disruption, and in this case, hostilely rejected. But this rejection occurs at the end of the story, and we must first hear about the one who receives the calling and is turned around, drawn out, and engaged in the process of cultivating friendship, fellowship. The allegory begins with a description of people living in a cavernous chamber underground, with an entrance open to the light and a long passage all down the cave. This long passage is significant for us as it symbolizes the journey or passage of the sage, the way, both as a manner of the movement and its direction, the breaking of ground and paths, as well as the outcome, the destination or destiny, which we have anticipated as the cultivation of community and friendship. This is the mindfulness produced in the wandering along the passageway. This long passage that leads to this subterranean cavern is important. As Cornford reminds us, quote, the length of the way in Isodos to the chamber where the prisoner sits is an essential feature, explaining why no daylight reaches them, unquote. These cave dwellers are indeed described in the story as incarcerated in a prison. The cave, as a prison, is a setting for a parable intended to depict the state of those who are uneducated and not engaged in the process of learning. The domestic is thus characterized as an oppressive state of ignorance. Quote, here they have been from childhood, chained by the leg and also by the neck, so that they cannot move and can see only what is in front of them, because the chains will not let them turn their heads. Republic 514A through B. The prisoners in this story are limited to a forward-looking gaze and unable to move about. What are we to make of this scenario where people are chained at their necks and feet? It is difficult not to have these images conjure up the images of the cross-Atlantic slave trade and the horrific Middle Passage, the horror of being taken from one's people, stripped naked, chained, and thrown into the bowels of a ship. Plato's story conjures up this and other horror stories of bondage and oppression inflicted by humans upon humans. Although we have had the opportunity to hear the liberatory poetics of the story's mood of hope and optimism, the tale is one initiated and culminating with dread and tragedy. Here in the bowels of this prison, we encounter the real source of the deep foreboding that appears with the grounding attunement, the evocative saying. If the story is an authentic saying of a sage, Socrates, then we must receive it with a mix of wonder, awe, and deep foreboding. From the beginning, we must identify this as a tragic tale, one that compels us to reconcile and think the opposites of oppression and liberation, bondage and freedom. This is a tale of the blues that intends to recollect our memory of trial and tribulation, of struggle against forces of oppression, and hope of overcoming this through the ever-expanding gathering of others in the cultivation of community. Thus, the opening lines of this story conjures up the abyss, which appeared to us as the emptiness of Kung, or what the Zen master Huneng called wu-yi-wu, nothingness, which Suzuki warns, quote, may push one down into a bottomless abyss, which no doubt will create a feeling of utter forlornness, unquote. This forlornness, or deep foreboding, initiates the transformative moment, the turning from the ignorance of domestic tranquility to the enlightenment of struggle, the struggle endured by those who are held out to the nothing and endure the dismantling, destruction of their comfort. But there is no comfort for the incarcerated, for the oppressed, only the pseudo-tranquility produced by the ignorance of their state of being. And that's how I ended. So, yeah, I'm going to let that speak for itself. What's interesting, I think, and important here is the coming back to Diotima. So the Cornford quotation. Cornford is a translator and editor, and he's someone that's edited the first copy of the Republic. The Republic, when I first read it at Fordham, we used Cornford's edition. So it's one of the reasons I go back to him. I used that copy, actually, when I was doing this work. That the enlightenment that we will follow, will happen in this story, he says, corresponds to the, quote, greater mysteries of which Diotima speaks in the symposium. So that was important to come back to. But for me, what's significant here, and it's something I've been working on in my work, contemporary work, is the sort of blues foundation, the reduction of this work to the blues. That the moment, and this goes back to the beginning of this, the writing, where the first question that's asked is, how is it with the nothing? And then the connections are made through Eastern philosophy to emptiness and to an encounter with emptiness. That first and foremost, one encounters the break, if you will, and the awakening, if you will, is one that causes deep foreboding. One is both awed and horrified, because one comes to realize that, in fact, one's situation is one that is that one lives in a kind of illusion, or that one lives in a situation of oppression. My colleague Ron Glass, who I met with last night, this is the work he does, is to help people in the Freudian tradition, to enable people, to create a space for people to tell their stories, that then in telling them and then seeing them on film or hearing them on audio, I'll enable them to recognize and hear themselves for the first time in the situation they're in. And then at that moment, then begins the blues. Because the blues, again, is not a running away from one's oppression or running away from one's realization that one has not taken one's freedom up, or that one didn't even recognize that one could do something, make a move, take up one's freedom. You don't run away from that, but you, from the effacement, from this immediate encounter with that, is the decision. That's the first moment, right, of freedom, where one says, yes, I can and I will do something. And so the blues, even in a situation where it seems utterly hopeless, is a gesture of hope, right? So the singing, the drumming, even in those cases where one remains an oppressed, bonded slave, emerging from that situation is music, and a music of hope, and a music of transcendence, a song and a spirit that lifts and rises up. And so what's important in this particular meditation is that important move, the recognition that at the root, and at the return, if you will, is this blues. And this is important, of course, because as I head into, in addition to this project, is, of course, the call to come to Memphis next year to do the Philosophy of Education Conference, which is thematized the blues, soul music. And that's where I'm going to leave it.